We are continuing in our study of the churches of Revelation 2 and 3. And as we said this morning, when we look at this, it's really a matter of the emphasis being what Jesus thinks of the church. Now, we said we're using the word church now in the local sense, because these are local churches that receive these letters. But as we said this morning, all the New Testament, when the Lord directed his word to be given through the apostles, what they said was what he said. But in a very direct way, Jesus is instructing John what to write to these 7 churches. And so we have representatively 7 churches of Asia with different situations that are good and some are bad. And the Lord, with all of this, he's helping us to see what the Spirit says to the churches and what he wants from us. And so when it comes to the church at Smyrna, we're in a different situation when we talk about what we know about Smyrna. This morning we said at Ephesus, there's a lot of information about Ephesus, more than any of the others. In the book of Acts, this is where Paul stayed and worked for some 3 years. And so you have that on the third journey. You have reference made to Ephesus in several passages in Acts, but also you have the book of Ephesians, and then you have reference in 1 Timothy to Paul's leaving Timothy at Ephesus. So we know a lot about Ephesus, and as far as the place and the church there, and a lot of information. On the other hand, regarding Smyrna, the only reference in the New Testament to Smyrna is just what we have right here in Revelation chapter 2. In fact, when you look at this happens to be, of the 7 letters, this is the shortest of the 7 letters. Verse 8, 9, 10, and 11, that's just 4 verses. So regarding Smyrna, in contrast to Ephesus, this is the entirety of what we have about Smyrna. Now, indirectly, we probably have more. And what I mean by that is, the text we referred to at other times in Acts chapter 19 that summarizes Paul's work at Ephesus is not just influencing that local area as large as it was, but Acts 19 and verse 10 will tell us during this stay in Ephesus, it will say that all that were in Asia heard the word. Now, this is referring to the Roman province of Asia. But when he says all that were in Asia heard the word, this is the answer to, well, how did all these other churches get started? For example, when we looked at Paul's prayer for the Colossians, he talked about Epaphras, that was a servant and worker with Paul, a fellow worker, but he says he's one of you and he's taught you. And Colossae was 100 miles east of Ephesus. But you have that kind of situation, and that may be exactly what happened here at Ephesus. What happened at Smyrna while Paul is at Ephesus. Smyrna is right up the coast from Ephesus. And so, again, no direct reference is made, but the broad statement of Acts 19 verse 10 is probably helpful from the standpoint of all that were in Asia heard the word. So beyond Ephesus, it's just spreading out, and we'll explain how, like we saw in Colossae recently in our study there, how you have these other congregations. So again, as we said this morning, John on the island of Patmos, and he's writing from here. He's there for the testimony of the Lord. He's exiled there. He was persecuted. And again, this we're looking at toward the end of the 1st century. And from there, he's writing the 7 churches of Asia. We saw Ephesus this morning, and as I say, due north, you have Smyrna. So where this shows Smyrna is just for the purpose of easy identification. Really, it would be more to your left, to the west, because it's right on the coast. It was a port city. And today, Ephesus, the Aegean Sea now has receded, well, because of filling in. It's 3 miles. You can still see the sea from Ephesus, but it's 3 miles. You know, I said here's the harbor road where you would get on a ship, but it's 3 miles to the sea. But at Smyrna, it's different, because Smyrna was a very deep harbor. And so you still have the harbor very close to what it would have been in New Testament times. It's worth repeating, as we said this morning, what John saw in the Revelation of chapter 1 was not a lampstand that was supporting 7 lamps, but rather he saw 7 lampstands. And so each congregation is going to be judged individually and stands on its own. So here is the 4-verse letter. The text says, "To the angel of the church in Smyrna write, these things says the first and the last, who is dead and came to life. I know your works, tribulation and poverty, but you are rich. And I know the blasphemy of those who are Jews, who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not fear any of those things which you are about to suffer. Indeed, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and you will have tribulation 10 days. Be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches." And then the promise that is made, "He who overcomes shall not be hurt by the second death." As we said this morning, it's helpful to know somewhat of the conditions in which our brethren in the first century lived. And I like for us to look at it that way. We have brethren in Gardendale. We have brethren in Cullman that are living today at this present time. But we also have brethren that have passed on, but they're still our brethren. There's one body. And so when we're reading this, we're reading a letter that was to our brethren. They just happen to live before we do. And so we're identifying with them, and we want to see the conditions under which they live, the situation. If you were living there at that time in the first century, what would it be like? What are some things that would be challenges for you? And we looked at some of those this morning in regard to Ephesus. Now, it's a similar situation at Smyrna, because idolatry was so pervasive. What you're looking at here is the ruins of the Temple of Athena. This is one of the oldest Greek temples in the world. This actually dates back to about 7 centuries before Christ. Can you imagine that? And so it's not just in the first century. This already, if you became a Christian at Smyrna in the first century, it was already well established that the goddess Athena would be worshiped there. But what also came along in the first century, as I mentioned, just everywhere you have the Imperial cult, where you have the pressure to burn incense to Caesar and to say Caesar is Lord. And this particular statue here is a statue of one of the priests of the Imperial cult. In other words, this would be the kind of person, real person, who would meet you as you would come to one of these temples, and you would be supplying money, he would be supplying the incense, and you would burn incense to Caesar. Now, Barclay, some of you have his commentary. He makes the point in his book that emperor worship had begun as spontaneous demonstration of gratitude to Rome. But toward the end of the first century, in the days of Domitian, the final step was taken, and Caesar worship became compulsory. Once a year, the Roman citizen must burn a pinch of incense on the altar to the godhead of Caesar, and having done so, he was given a certificate to guarantee he had performed his religious duty. And so this, again, when we're trying to identify with our brethren at Smyrna, brethren in the first century, and here they've heard the gospel, and they were glad to know that there's salvation in Christ Jesus, because that tomb was found empty, and he died for our sins and was raised again, and in him alone redemption is found. And so they heard the good news, and they responded to that. But it's not going to be easy, because in their society, in their culture, it was permeated, as I say, with various forms of idolatry. This is Smyrna today. It's a modern city, and I took this particular photo from the Acropolis looking down, but you can still see the sea, and it's actually one of the busiest ports in Turkey today. In fact, while we're here, I can encircle where we're going to go down below. You see my red circle down there at the bottom. And so we're going to go down below, because this is a modern city. This morning when I was showing you a little bit about Ephesus, it's not a modern city. I mean, there's been more excavation there that's been done than just about anywhere, but it was the 4th largest city in the world, a great city of importance. And here you have some things of antiquity, but it's basically a modern city today. But let's go down there and see what it is. This is the agora, actually. Agora is, or the agora. You'll hear it pronounced both ways. But this is the marketplace, again, that dates back to Roman times. And so you can go there and see what would be left there. Actually, this is the upper level. Down below, there were shops and businesses where the agora is the place where you would buy and sell and meet and talk with people. It's equivalent to the marketplace, but it's more than buying and selling. That's just where interactions, kind of like, especially in older times, where on Saturdays, like the courthouse, the court square, that sort of thing. That's what this served, and each of the Roman cities would have the agora, the marketplace. And so that's where we are here. This would be central to ancient Smyrna in the days of the first century. And as you mill about, you can actually see some of the inscriptions that are there. For example, right here, we see an inscription to Trajan, and a couple of words that are of interest there. He is the autocrator, and which is designating him as having rule and dominion. So again, Roman presence that is there. Another thing that we saw was characteristic of Ephesus. We talked about this Neocorus, the temple warden, the temple keeper. When a temple that was erected to the Roman emperors, that it's recognized by Rome as they're giving their stamp of approval. I mean, cities, you wouldn't believe it, but cities competed for this honor to be designated as the Neocorus, the temple keeper. And it was considered a big deal by them to be awarded that status. Ephesus was awarded that status, but also Smyrna was as well. And there is your word, Neocorus. Again, one of the inscriptions found in the agora. And I'm going to just show you a couple of other things and move on. But Poseidon, the god of the sea, this was also, archaeologists have excavated this in the agora, again showing some of the idolatry that is there, the sacred fountain that is there. But let's go on and let's look at the 4-verse letter itself. I mentioned this morning, Ephesus is the church that left its first love. Smyrna is the poor church that was rich. And where I get that, where that's drawn from in verse 9, I know your works, tribulation, and poverty, but you are rich. Well, that's a paradox. I know your poverty. To be in poverty is to be poor. To be in poverty is antithetical to being rich. And yet that's what we have here. I know your poverty, but you are rich. And so there's Jesus, who knows all things. He sees their tribulation. I know your works. I know your tribulation, and I know your poverty, and I know you're having to endure persecution from the Jewish source. Not only do you have Roman persecution, but Jews who say they are Jews but are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. That kind of reminds me of the conversation Jesus had during his ministry of John chapter 8, when the Jews would protest that Abraham is our father. No, he's not your father. If he were, you'd do the works of Abraham. Well, God is our father. No, if God were your father, then you would love me. And Jesus went on to say, you are of your father the devil, and the lust of your father it is your will to do. And so here, that's the kind of language that Jesus is using right here in this letter regarding that element of persecution. It is a historical fact that this is where Polycarp, who again traces teaching immediately being involved as a disciple of John the Apostle. But it was here that he was put to death in the year 156 BC. And historians tell us that when he was pressed to swear the oath to Caesar and revile the Christ, that he responded, 46 years have I been his servant, and he has done me no wrong. How then can I blaspheme my king who saved me? And with those words, the fire was lit and he was burned at the stake. So, and again, Jewish persecution was behind that, according to historians. But let's get back, though, to this concept that they're poor, but they're rich. What does that mean? Well, it's saying that economically they are destitute, but spiritually they were rich. Now, the thing that bears a bit of attention there, and will be brought out in the book, is of the book of Revelation, is that this is a place where there's a lot of commerce. You've already seen the harbor there, and there are a lot of work opportunities. It's not that there was not any work to be found, but again, in that world of the first century, the trade guilds would have patron gods and goddesses. And if you wanted to find work, ordinarily, you'd be in one of those guilds, and that's going to involve you going to an idol's temple and eating things sacrificed to idols and participating, to get along to do that. And for a person to say, well, no, I want to work. I want to provide for my family, but I can't have anything to do with that. Oftentimes, taking that stand would mean that you would not be able to find work. And so many would suggest that that is the reason here that he would speak of poverty, people that were poor, in a situation that there would be lots of work to be found. But if you were going to be taking a stand against the idolatry that went with the trade guilds, you were out of luck. And so Jesus is not saying, well, you got to eat, and so give a little, get a little. There's none of that is suggested here. Jesus is commending them. I know that. I know your poverty, but you're rich. Now, we're not there yet. It'll be Devin's turn to deal with Laodicea. But there's a contrast, because Laodicea thought they were rich, and they were rich materially. It's one of those interesting things. When there was an earthquake, and this area is prone to earthquakes, that caused great destruction in Laodicea, from Rome, the government said, we'll send out help, and we'll rebuild. And do you know what Laodicea said? They said, no thanks, we don't need your money, we'll rebuild it ourselves. I mean, that's just about unthinkable. Who would turn down money from the government? Laodicea did. They said, we don't need your money, we'll rebuild it ourselves. And Laodicea thought they were rich, but Jesus said, you say you're rich, but you're poor and miserable and blind and wretched and naked. But that's another study. I'm just saying that's a contrast with a church that thought they were rich, but they were very poor. And Jesus told them, you're not rich, you're poor, and you need to get true riches from me. That's Laodicea. But here at Smyrna, he's saying you're actually very rich. And what that means is their riches were in heaven. Jonathan, you won't mind me mentioning that I read from Jonathan's tribute to his dad, Brady, at the funeral last Tuesday. And the things that Brady had quietly done to help others with his money, with his resources. It wasn't that he had a lot of money, but so often he would be found helping people and helping gospel preachers and helping people in need. And that money could have been put in a bank somewhere, but he was laying up treasure in heaven. And their treasures were in heaven. They were building for eternity. The thing I'd like you to notice about this is that I know when we have a problem, you're like I am. If I've got a problem, I'd like for it to go away. If I'm hurting, if I'm in pain, I'd kind of like for it to go away. Aren't you like that? I mean, we go to the doctors to help me with this. I want it to go away, make it go away. If there's a problem, what do we want? We want the problem to be solved. But here when Jesus is laying out the situation and saying that, I know your poverty, I know your tribulation, I know that there are people that are blaspheming you, and he even talks about more suffering and the 10 days, which is symbolic, but that number of days of tribulation, cast into prison. And what does he say? Be faithful unto death. In other words, what I'm saying is, Jesus is not saying in this letter, we're just going to remove the difficulties. We're going to make it go away. That's not the thing that is promised. And so as Jesus is looking, he's saying, I know your situation. I know all about it. And we need that assurance that Jesus knows whatever we're going through. He knows, and he sees that with perfect vision. And he cares as our merciful high priest. But that doesn't mean that the problem that might be of concern to us is somehow going to go away. And so what they have is the Lord's promise and admonition to be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. And so that's the word that he's given to Smyrna. By the way, I don't know how many times I've heard people summarize the letters to these churches, and I know what we're trying to do. We all do this. We like to make things simple, and so we'll say, well, all these churches, there was a combination of good and bad in all of them. And that's actually not true. That's when you look at the letter to Smyrna, it's unlike the letter to Ephesus. This morning, after commending those things we read, Jesus said, nevertheless, I have this against you. There is no nevertheless with the church at Smyrna, that letter. There's no but. He's not saying, I know these things, but, and you need to correct this. In other words, this church is only commended. With this congregation, there are only good things mentioned. Now, that doesn't mean the people were sinlessly perfect, everybody was perfectly developed, and there's no room for improvement. But it's one of those situations where you're doing the right thing, and what you need to do is to abound yet more and more. And that's involved in this admonition to be faithful unto death. And I will give you the crown of life. In the Greek text, in the New Testament, as well as in the Greek language, there are two words for crown. One is the word from which we get the word diadem. And that word for crown is like what a king would wear, that ruling with a crown. But then there's another word, and that's the word Stephanos. And that's a different kind of crown. That's a crown that the athlete would be given. Actually, it was a crown that was perishable ordinarily. It was a wreath. And this is a statue that shows exactly what the victor's crown would have looked like. And that's what is promised. Not that you're going to be crowned like a king, but you won the victory. This is the victor's crown. This is what the runner received when he won the race, and that's the promise that is given. And by the way, in one of the museums, there's also a crown of that nature that you can see that is displayed there. But that's the promise, to be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. Now, the idea of be faithful unto death certainly involves be faithful as long as you live. But it's more than that. It's be faithful even if it costs your life. Even to the point of death is the idea. And that's the thing that is required. And it may cost us that. And Jesus is saying, be faithful unto death. And he says, here's the promise, you'll not be hurt by the second death. The Bible in the book of Revelation talks about the second death. The second death is really bad. The second death is discussed in the closing chapters as the lake that burns with fire and brimstone. This is where people go whose names are not written in the Lamb's book of life. This is when one dies in sin in a lost condition. That's the second death. Now, spiritually, one can be dead and still be living here on earth before one passes. For example, in 1 Timothy 5 and verse 6, she that gives herself to pleasure is dead while she lives. And so I think that one could say in the sense there's that first death where one is spiritually dead. But that can be changed if one will respond to the gospel. But if one dies without hope and without God and the world, that second death, that's final. That is eternal. That's the lake that burns with fire and brimstone. And that's what we need to be concerned about. You know, back when people lived there in Smyrna 2,000 years ago, they'd be very concerned about their status and how much they had in this world's goods. But what matters now, 2,000 years later, since this letter? Does it matter if somebody was a slave or a king at this point? If they had a lot of money or did not have a lot of money, there's one thing that matters. Were they faithful unto death? And if they died in a saved condition, that's all that matters now. That's the thing that's important. If we could only see that. Be faithful unto death, and I'll give you the crown of life. I did want to show you this in Jerusalem. This is a gate known as St. Stephen's Gate. And this takes us back to the book of Acts, where when he preached that sermon in Acts chapter 7, and the Jewish council gnashed on him with their teeth and dragged him outside the city and stoned him to death. And as he was dying, he said he saw the Lord standing in glory. And they stoned him, and he said, Lord, lay not this sin to their charge. And so it is said by many that this would have been the area where that took place. And so we're outside the walls looking toward Jerusalem, but this is at St. Stephen's Gate. And I use that just to illustrate that Stephen is the kind of person that the Lord is talking about here. Stephen in Acts 7, that he was faithful even to the point of death. And of course there would be many others. He happens to be the first in the book of Acts. Jesus would say during his teaching, and I was looking ahead to this passage here, Matthew 16, verse 25, whoever desires to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. And so Jesus taught that there will be persecution. In Matthew chapter 5 and verse 8, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when men shall revile you and persecute you and say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so persecuted they the prophets who were before you. The Apostle Paul taught in 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 12, yea, and all who would live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. I would simply say to you that heaven will surely be worth it all. And in this short letter to the church at Smyrna, we see the Lord seeing his people. We see his encouraging them. And they're living on earth. They're living with problems. And some of them will be in prison. Some of them may die for their faith. But he encourages them to be faithful with the promise that they will overcome. And they will inherit life eternal. And they will be spared from that second death. And he that has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Tonight, if you're subject to the Lord's invitation to become a child of his, we're not hiding from you the fact that there will be persecution. We're not saying that if you become a Christian, all your problems will go away. The Bible doesn't say that. And when people leave that impression, they are misleading people. We're saying that whatever comes your way, the Lord has promised to be with you, and he'll never forsake you. And you can do all things through Christ who strengthens you. And he will give us strength. He will enable us to do those things that he requires of us, no matter how difficult or challenging they may be. If you're subject in any way to the Lord's invitation, we encourage your response as we stand and sing.